Hello everyone, in today's video we are going to talk about the easiest way to paint watercolor gingerbread houses. I promise you this process is so simple. I'm not using any white paint. I'm going to go over all of the materials used and the process from start to finish. So let's get started. First, we are going to start by sketching the shape of our house. A lot of my students get really overwhelmed with the sketching process of painting, but the great thing about gingerbread houses is they are usually very basic shapes because you have to cut out the dough, and so they are not very intricate. So we're going to start with a triangle for the front of the house and a rhombus for the roof, and then we are going to bring the lines down for the sides of the house. And that's it. We just want the basic outline of the gingerbread house so we know where to put our icing designs. I also sketched in some kind of wavy lines for the ground because I want that to be kind of a snowy area, so we'll keep that area really light with watercolor and a little path. And I thought it might be fun to have a really flat gingerbread tree next to the house. So the star of the show is something called masking fluid. Masking fluid is a way to mask off the paper so that we can use the white of the paper for white things like icing without having to use white paint. It is a kind of rubbery material that starts out liquid, but I'm going to show you how to use it. So first of all, we're going to use dish soap, and we're going to get a pretty decent brush, not your favorite brush, but one that still is pretty nice. Some people like to use a crappy brush, but I like to use a brush that is pretty decent so that I can actually paint with it well. And I am going to thoroughly get the soap in all of the bristles, all the way up to the top, and rub it in very well. If there is soap in the bristles, the masking fluid will not stick and it will not ruin the brush. So now the brush is ready and we can use our masking fluid. Give it a good shake, and I like to use the lid as a little container to dip my brush into so that I don't have to dip my brush into the whole bottle every time I need to refill. So here's the idea behind masking fluid. Everywhere you put the masking fluid, the paper will be white. We can place the masking fluid in any design and shape that we want, and then we let it dry. We paint over it however we want, as much as we want, and then once that is dry, we remove the masking fluid to reveal the white paper underneath. So with that in mind, we need to completely surround the masking fluid once it's dry with watercolor for the white design that we are putting down on the paper right now to show up. So for thinking about a gingerbread house, we need to start with the outlines of the house. So that's the easiest place to start. I'm starting with the lines of the roof, and I'm kind of drooping down some of those lines into little icicle shapes. Doesn't have to be perfect. That's the beauty of painting gingerbread houses. I like to lean into the homemade, imperfect, chaotically messy icing look because that's how it would really look. Even the best, most skilled artisan would have a little bit of a wiggle every now and then in their icing, right? So I'm trying not to worry too much about perfect lines, and I get a very good drop, like a big droplet is on my brush of the masking fluid, and I feel like that really helps me to move smoothly in my lines. And there's a lot on the paper. It's bulging. It's a big little droplet in each of the designs. It takes a little bit longer for it to dry that way, but I prefer it because if you don't use enough, it's very hard to see. Even though this is colored masking fluid that is tinted so that you can see it, if you paint it really flat on the paper, it's still very hard to see where your designs are. So I would rather have a lot and be able to see my designs as I'm going than not be able to see them. Now let's talk about some tips for using masking fluid and making designs. When you are masking something off that has a pretty heavy design, make sure that you're not doing so much design that paint cannot get in between your designs. For example, if you were actually icing this gingerbread house, you might do a little dot or a heart in between each of these little crisscross panels. But when you are painting a gingerbread house, you're going to need a lot more surface area of gingerbread than you think. So try to keep your designs really simple. Try to keep your designs from touching each other in some of the most important details. Obviously, these little crisscross panels can touch. But for example, here on the window, I don't want the edges of the design that I make around the outside to touch the icicles as much as possible, because with masking fluid, we aren't going to see the definition between the designs. It's just going to all look like one white blob when we take the masking fluid off. Also, make sure you look up designs that you like on gingerbread houses. Not every design that might come into your head will translate well to not only a gingerbread house, but also a watercolor painting of a gingerbread house. So I did look up lots of different designs and different elements that I really liked, window shapes, door shapes, different patterns you can do on rooftops, and these are the designs that I came up with. Things that are slightly curved, crisscross designs like I have on the roof always really look nice, especially when we add the shadows. All right, let's talk about what to do if you make a mistake with masking fluid. Here on this left window, I add too much masking fluid on the left side of the window and the window pane kind of completely disappears. There's nothing I can really do about it at this point, but that doesn't mean all hope is lost. Once the masking fluid is completely dry, if there's really something you don't like, you can just remove it, just with your finger or an eraser, and if another part that you don't want lifts up, you can literally just paint the more masking fluid over the top and kind of connect those masking fluid pieces together. So it's pretty easy to course correct, but you just need to wait for it to dry. Another thing that you can do, which is actually what I chose to do in this situation, is because the masking fluid was covering up too much of the window pane, I wasn't going to get enough paint in the square that I needed. So later when I take the masking fluid off, I just add more paint and complete the square. So if it's an easy fix like that where, say you're doing one of the loop-dees on the bottom of the house and you don't leave enough space or it kind of globs up in the center, you can just let it dry, paint over it, and then when you remove the masking fluid, you can just add the little circle to create a center. I put some masking fluid in these kind of chunky shapes lining the walkway because we are going to paint around this snowy area that's at the base of our house, just a little bit, but I thought, we're going to put some color in, even though it's going to look very snowy. I still want the look of maybe some icing that is kind of lining this pathway. So for the side of the house, I really wanted to do a wreath, but a wreath is pretty hard to translate. So I just did a circle with textured edges. And then I did a bow on one side, and as I was painting the bow, I knew I hated it. I think it's cute. I probably should have just done another bow on the other side. But I already knew I wanted to do this kind of swirly S shape on the other side. So I did this S shape and a bow and a wreath, and it was just too much. So when this completely dries, I do remove the bow and mimic this kind of swirly S shape on the other side as well. And then I did a little bit more of that chunky, just kind of random shape at the base of the house for that snowy texture again. And I think maybe now you can see after watching me use my brush with the masking fluid that even though you don't want to use your favorite brush, you still need a decent brush to get the shapes that you want, to get it to, move the way that you're used to painting with a brush. Sometimes I use a crappy brush and the bristles are frayed and it's just so thick and weird that I can't even get the right shapes. But the dish soap is holding up very well, and now I'm moving on to the designs on the tree. I went for a very swoopy design with the tree, is a great way to outline it. But don't forget that you need to outline the entire thing. So even if you were icing a regular gingerbread tree and you weren't going to do the designs up the sides, you still need to put a little bit of the masking fluid on the sides so that we can contain the brown that we paint inside. And that will become more clear later if you're not familiar with how masking fluid works. It's kind of going to keep all of our watercolor colors inside the areas that we paint them, and they won't bleed out, kind of like an outline, painting in the lines without having to worry about it. It's kind of holding the line for us. Now with some masking fluid on my brush, I am going to tap the back of my brush with my pencil to create masking fluid splatter. I love doing this because everywhere the little dots kind of chaotically and randomly fall, that's where we're going to have little speckles of white paper. So I love being able to add that texture before we've even started painting. Then I pour my masking fluid back into the bottle and make sure to rinse the lid and the brush very well. Now you can see how much different the masking fluid looks once it has dried. I was able to remove the bow that I didn't feel like fit and added my little swirl. And it wasn't until the very end of my painting process that I realized it kind of looks like it says SOS. So we'll just ignore it because the other S shape is backwards. It's just a frill. It's a curly Q. If you have made it this far in this painting process, then you have already finished all of the hard part because the rest of this is easy. We're pretty much filling in the gaps. There's not a whole lot of skill except for thinking about where you're going to paint it. So we are mixing our own brown. I love mixing my own brown using magenta, cad yellow, and cerulean. Now I like when my browns lean a little bit pink, but also a little bit more yellow. I don't want them to be like a grayish pinky color. I want them to be a warm pinky color. So we're starting to get to the brown that I want for the base of the gingerbread just by using those three colors. I did swipe at the sap green a little bit, but I would say it was very minimal. Now using that same color as a base, we're also going to mix together a color for the sky because I do need some kind of color to surround our masking fluid so the white on the edges of the gingerbread houses stands out. And I wanted this to be a little bit more pink, so I added magenta, and I wanted it also to be very light. So as I'm painting, I'm realizing it's pretty bold, so I just keep adding water until I get the consistency and the color that I like. I want the sky to be lighter than the gingerbread because I still want the gingerbread to be kind of the main character, the main focus, but I just need some kind of color to outline and help define those white areas once we remove the masking fluid. I'm only going to be putting this color in the sky. I don't need to be painting inside the gingerbread at this point, and it's really nice because the masking fluid gives you a really nice line. You don't really have to worry about going over the line. You can paint on top of the masking fluid as long as you're not overzealous and going into the gingerbread house. So it's just really nice because you don't have to be super, super careful, which is one of the reasons why I think this is way easier than painting gingerbread and then adding white paint. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. I'm also using the side swiping motion with this wet on dry technique into the snow area to get some of this color defined in the snow, because we do have some of the masking fluid in those patchy shapes, like around the front walkway to define some snowy areas. We're going to use some of this pink color to kind of enhance around those snowy patches so that we can actually see those snowy patches when we take the masking fluid off. So we can just add a little bit there for shadows and details and depth within the snow, but we're going to keep most of it white so it still looks very snowy. And then you'll see I'm not even doing anything to our paint puddle. I'm just picking up more pigment and dropping it into those already wet areas, and it naturally and gradually will increase the pigment in some of the areas. So it's a really nice way to add shadows or the look of shadows without changing the pigment color and really mixing any more paints. We can just pick up some of the same pigment we've been using and continue to add it to the wet paper, especially as it begins to dry and becomes more damp. It will change the color and the feeling, so you can work pretty quickly to kind of mess with things a little bit as it all starts to dry. And again, I think this is why masking fluid gingerbread houses are, in my opinion, way easier than painting the white on afterward, because once I have the masking fluid down, it's kind of like I'm coloring in a coloring book. I painted the pink inside the lines. I kind of played around with the colors on the snow, but I really wasn't focused on a lot of detail. There's not really a whole lot of skill that I'm doing at this point. And then now for the gingerbread, I'm using the brown color we mixed, and I am painting inside the lines. And I really don't feel like the masking fluid technique we used in the beginning to do the designs was also very difficult either. And I have painted white on a gingerbread house before. I have done that technique, and it's kind of hard. Using white paint on the top of watercolor can be really tricky, especially when you need to do so much. It's great for little bits here and there, but when you need to paint so much like in this piece, it just is so much easier to preserve the white of the paper. And you can see here, I'm just using all of that brown that we've mixed up and placing it right on top of the masking fluid. So we're just pretty much coloring in the gingerbread house. I want it to be as even as possible, and just using up all of that beautiful mixture we've created to get that base color. Also, remember that watercolor dries a lot lighter than it initially appears, so you can make your base layer a little bit darker than you might initially want, but if you start with a base layer that's too light, you'll just need to add another layer on top of that before moving on to the shadow layer. Once I have everything filled in, I like to go over everything again, just a quick swipe to make sure it's all even and kind of equal in each section, because it's easy for one section to get darker than the other. So just a quick swipe to make sure it's all as equal and even as possible. And then I'm actually going to use a hairdryer. You can use a heat tool, but I really want to make sure it's very, very dry. For every part of this process, you'll see me use it even more. So now we're going to mix up some more brown, but this time we are going to mix up a dark, shadowy brown. So pretty much all of the colors we used before, but maybe it leans a little bit more cerulean. And we're also mixing up a thicker consistency of the paint because we don't want it to blend and bleed and kind of pool like we did the first layer. We want it to be really thick and stark and have a nice edge. So now it's time for shadows. Yay! This is the most important part of this piece. This is the part that takes it from a very flat, boring painting into a 3D, more realistic, stunning piece that makes everyone go, whoa, that's so cool. And again, masking fluid makes this so easy. We're pretty much just using the masking fluid as a guide to paint our shadows. So decide where your light source is coming from. Mine's coming from the left side. And then paint your shadows as if the light was hitting some of these bumps of icing and then casting a shadow on the right side. If the masking fluid wasn't there, we would need to find a way after we painted the icing in white to then go and add all of these shadows individually. But because the masking fluid is there, it is just, again, so easy. We just paint on top of the masking fluid and make sure that there are shadows on the right side. So the right side of our little swirlies, the SOS, just kidding, it's not an SOS. The right side of our wreath, the right side of the lines on, the edges of the house. And you can see it's really starting to pop, especially in comparison to the front of the house that we haven't touched yet. And that's why it's important to have a semi-light base. You can see how light this base color dried, and then a pretty dark shadow. Not too dark. We don't want black, we don't want gray. We want it to still be in that color family so it looks like a really nice natural shadow, but it needs to be a thicker consistency and lean a little bit more blue, and it will make that perfect shadow. Again, you don't have to be perfect with this because the icing is uneven. The whole thing is just an iced gingerbread and it's not supposed to look perfect. So you can see how quickly I'm swiping these shadows in. They don't have to be perfect. The masking fluid does a lot of the work of blocking you from putting in a lot of weird shadows. Also, if you have a hard time with shadows, you can look up pictures of gingerbread houses and see how the shadows lie. Or look up a picture of almost anything that has a really harsh shadow to help you get an idea of where the shadows are sitting. The shadows really are the most important part of this piece because without it, everything is flat. But don't let that overwhelm you. Just put them in the best you can and try to be as consistent as possible with putting them on the same side for every object. I would say probably one of the things you do have to think about is if you are painting the shadows in a smaller confined area like the spaces on this tree, try to make sure you're not filling in the entire section with the shadow and that you're leaving some of that base color shown. But you can paint more onto the masking fluid and just slightly onto the paper, and that can really help. But there are some places like inside those window panes and inside the little loop-de-doos that are just going to be complete shadow, and that's okay. I'm also putting a tiny bit of this darker color around some of the snowy patches that we had on the ground, and then I am going back in with that same mixture. Again, I haven't added any darker pigment or change the consistency in any way, but I am adding a little bit more contrast to each of the shadow areas, especially as everything starts to dry, not only in the tree, but on the rest of the house here. I can just increase that pigment a tiny bit in some of the areas that might need it a little bit more. With more dark brown on our brush, we are going to use our pencil to tap our brush and create some brown splatter. Now, we did some of the masking fluid splatter earlier. This is going to give us now the brown texture to complement the white texture once we remove the masking fluid. And I just thought this was the perfect piece to create that kind of texture and look because the splatters kind of remind me of the spices in gingerbread. So I don't do a lot of splatter, but I thought this was perfect for it. Now we have reached the best part of the project, removing the masking fluid. But first I'd like to hit it with the blow dryer again to make sure it is very, very dry. It is so heartbreaking to start removing masking fluid and smear paint everywhere because it wasn't fully dry. So again, make sure it's all the way dry, and then we get to remove the masking fluid. This was so satisfying. I got so much of this rooftop off in one giant pull like this. I mean, there's not a lot of things more satisfying than peeling masking fluid off. So sometimes it comes off really nicely like this. Sometimes you use your finger or an eraser, or there are masking fluid remover tools. I like to use a very clean, dry finger because I feel like I can feel where the masking fluid is. It's a very tactile thing for me. And I also feel like when I use an eraser, I'm erasing and removing some of the pigment that I really want to stay on my painting. So I don't like using that as much as possible. It's looking so beautiful. That yellow really messes with your mind after a while. You start thinking it looks really ugly until all of this beautiful white icing is starting to appear. But I do have a few tips. If your masking fluid is ripping your paper, if it's coming off and ripping your paper, you either didn't use it on dry paper or your paper is not high enough quality for masking fluid. Try using a all cotton paper like Arches or Bao, something that can really handle masking fluid. It comes off very easily. I've never had any ripping. At this point, even though it looks so good because the white is popping, it's so beautiful and bright, and the shadows look great, it still looks flat. It falls flat a little bit, and that's because icing is curved. It has roundness to it. So even though there is shadow on the gingerbread, there's also a little bit of shadow on the icing. Now this part is easy. I promise it's easier than it seems because we're just taking that pinkish brown color that we've already made, adding a lot of water to it. So it's very, very light because we don't want to lose the white. That white that we saved for so long, we don't want to lose it. And we are just going to follow the shadow lines that we've already done. The pink lines, these light pink lines, and the shadow lines, they need to match. They need to be together. So we are going to place them near the shadow lines on the white icing to create curvature and roundness in the icing. So it's kind of a little bit of a shadow to give you the idea that it's not just a flat piece of paper, but that it's a rounded object. The fun part about the pink lines is they do not have to be exact. They don't even have to be as exact as we place the shadows. I'm really just dancing my brush around on the icing, following the shadow lines, making sure they kiss, they're together, they're matching, and keeping as much of the white as possible. Because if we lose some of the white, it will kind of lose some of its potency. It'll just maybe look like pink icing. So we really just want a touch of that color to give the icing depth. And this is another reason why I think this is easier than, say, if we painted white on top of a painted gingerbread house. Because if we were trying to paint depth into some flat white paint, it would get mixed in together. It's harder to paint watercolor on top of white paint or white gouache, but it's easy to paint the white paper. And we really don't have to worry about staying in the lines because it's so light that it's not really appearing on the gingerbread and it's only appearing on the icing just how we want it. And I love that right here you can see the difference between the two windows with the very stark white with no pink paint and then the light pink paint on the right, and how it really makes everything pop, because the shadows are great, but the little pink shadows on the icing is what makes this incredible. It'll make everybody say, holy moly, look at all this work you did. And most of it, you were just coloring in the lines. I mean, really, if you think about it, all of this, even this part of the painting right now, is easy because of the masking fluid. So all of the prep work that you do to get the masking fluid the way you want it, everything is just so simple after that. Don't forget to also add some of the pink to the snow or the icing at the base of the house, along the walkway, and especially on that beautiful tree. The fun thing about this design is really the sky is the limit. You could add a gingerbread person, you could add more trees, a whole gingerbread forest, you could do a gingerbread village. This would be a fun idea to do with like family and friends where everybody has a gingerbread competition, but it's painting or watercolor. So there's just so many different things and ways you can make this your own. You could even find a way to add watercolor candy and make it super bright and colorful. Now I'm mixing up some more dark brown so we can fix some of the shadow areas. So inevitably you're going to need to fix some areas because masking fluid is not perfect and sometimes things mesh together more than you wanted, especially we had talked about that window earlier. So with just a couple of strokes of this dark brown, I'm able to open that window up really nicely and make that look so much better. I can define some of the shadows. I can help even out some of the shapes if there was too much masking fluid that left too much white space. But just be careful with this part because it's very easy to overdo this dark color and lose some of the definition in your white lines or make your white lines thinner as you're trying to overcorrect. So just keep this as minimal as possible to fix some of the areas and then call it done. Thank you so much for being here with me today while I showed you my favorite and easiest way to paint beautiful gingerbread houses. I hope this was super helpful for you and you learned a lot, and that you take this into your daily practice and you paint some gingerbread houses this holiday season. I will see you all in my next video. Bye.